Alright. Hey guys, my name is Asher. I am doing this for a project for an English class. Strange, I know, but here we are. Now it is happening, so the prompt for this project was to turn an essay we previously wrote into something multimodal, which means like taking it from words on a paper to a YouTube video, a PowerPoint with voiceover, that kind of thing. Just something different, essentially. And I decided to write my paper on Loki and how the current media specifically represents him, compared to how he was represented back in ye olden days. So my biggest thing is really getting people to ask themselves the question, was Loki the villain? Really? Like, was he the villain or was he the victim? And a lot of things that, go over the entire history of Norse mythology, like all of the books written and published as if they have some form of, otherworldly knowledge that we don't know about. And some of them are just plain wrong, I've discovered. The biggest viewpoints you see when anybody talks about Loki are the things he's done. Oh my god, he cut off Sif's hair. He stole the apples of immortality. He killed Balder, everybody's favorite child, essentially. And everybody sees these crimes and they're just like, oh yeah, he was the villain, obviously. Think about that for a second. How rare is it that you come across somebody that's truly good, never done a bad thing in their lives? Or somebody truly evil who has never been good at all? If you dig a little further into Norse mythology, there's a lot to be said about Loki, really. And it's a lot of things that people don't touch on, especially if they're writing these long books about Norse mythology. Book-wise, it really is a 50-50, I've discovered. Whether you open a book up and it's like, oh yes, here is Loki. He represented fire. He was the trickster god. He did this and here's why. Here's what happened and that caused this. And then you have the other 50% where you open it up and quite literally it says, Loki is evil incarnate, period, and nothing more. So obviously there's a bit of discrepancy between everything going on. But if you really look at all of Loki's crimes, there is a pattern. Let me give you a little bit of backstory. So, in order to save everybody's brain, and my own, I'm not going to get into the timeline, like the exact timeline of Norse mythology, because it's one of those where the past, the present, and the future all exist currently in this moment and are happening at the same time. Yes, think about that for a second. It's not an easy thing to discuss, especially not for time's sake. That is an entire video on itself. The other thing is that due to Marvel's character that they have called Loki, and a few other instances of this, it is widely believed that Loki is the brother of Thor. No. And I hate to be the one to tell you this, but no. If anything, he would have been considered Thor's uncle, in our terms. Essentially, he was Odin's blood brother, which has a few different definitions for it, I guess, in the end. It's essentially a blood oath swearing that, hey, we're bros forever. Nobody really knows why they took that oath. It's just a fact of life, essentially, for them, especially. But that's a little something you need to know. The other thing, Loki was in fact Jotun, the one thing Marvel got right. Which means he was a giant. Now, he was obviously friends with the Asgardians. He was Odin's blood brother. They hung out, they ate, they had dinner, they were fun. They're little frenzies. But the thing that I see all the time is how it kind of gets skewed a little bit. Everybody wants to label Loki as the villain when he was friends with the Aesir first. So it doesn't quite make sense that he would just be the villain. So getting into this, I've tried to compile everything as chronologically as possible. As stated before, that is very difficult. But we're going to try. But I'm going to start off with the building of the Asgardian wall. So, essentially, there was this big fight, war, blah, 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 blah. They got over it. They got over themselves. But Odin, especially, was insistent that they build a wall around Asgard to defend themselves. But they couldn't decide who would build the wall. None of the gods or Aesir wanted to do it. I mean, obviously Odin didn't want to do it himself. And it turned from a war to them bickering amongst themselves over who was going to build a wall. And one day, lo and behold, a man rides across the Bifrost on his horse. He walks up to Heimdall, insists he have an audience with not just Odin, but all of these guardians. And from that point, after a little bit of bickering with Heimdall himself, he does get his audience. Now, this is where things get a little bit hairy. Essentially, there was a deal made, with a little bit of a negotiation in between. Initially, the man wanted the sun, the moon, and the god Freya for his wife. And he would build the wall. And obviously that did not go over well with everybody there. So after a little bit of like a little group meeting, Loki came up with the idea of putting an expiration date on it. It was about the time of the winter solstice. And so they all agreed that if the man could not finish the wall by the summer solstice, then he would still finish the wall, but he would get nothing. But if he did, then he would get everything he asked for. Yeah. It soon became quite clear, once this man started working on the wall, that things were not as they appeared. After a little bit of time and speculation, just from seeing what the man could do and how fast he was moving, it became obvious pretty quickly that this was not a human. This was a giant. And they were in trouble because the wall was almost finished with 3 days to spare. Obviously, this caused a little bit of an uproar. And since Loki was the one that decided to renegotiate, Odin told him that it was his job to fix it. So, if you're a little bit familiar with this, you know where this is going. If you're not, I'm sorry. So Loki turned himself into a mare. And in order to prolong the process of building the wall, he lured away the builder's horse. And then got pregnant. Again, if you knew about this, yep. If you didn't, I'm sorry. So, it worked. It did work. Wall wasn't finished. It still got finished. They had a wall. Freya was safe. I don't really think they cared about the sun and the moon, to be honest. But Loki was pregnant. And he just kind of dropped off out of the universe for a little bit there. Nobody saw him for months and months. And he comes back with this little eight-legged fowl. His name is Sleipnir. I am smiling. I think it's adorable. It is kind of an adorable story. Until you get to the part where this is also up for debate and has some discrepancies. On one side of it, it's Loki willingly gave Sleipnir to Odin as a warhorse. On the other side of it, Odin was so disgusted with Loki that he took his child himself to be his warhorse, and Loki was not allowed to see him. Discrepancies, but either way, it's kind of like maybe he didn't feel like, the parental love for Sleipnir, but at the same time, that was his child. So in between Sleipnir and everything else I'm going to get into, there was a moment that is honestly used a lot in reference to Loki being the villain. So as I said before, Loki was Jotun. He was a giant. And giants are the personification of chaos. So I think it's well within Loki's right to have a little bit of what he views as fun. Now, he saw Sif in her hair, and how the goddess and Thor cherished it so much. They took so much pride in it. Because Sif's hair represented the harvest, the wealth of the harvest. And Loki just thought it would be funny to cut it off. Now, I'm not saying he was right here. Okay? That's not what I'm saying at all. I am saying it's like when a 5-year-old, slaps somebody and thinks it's funny. It's kind of like that, in my brain anyway. Because, like I said, personification of chaos. He thought it would be funny. He didn't understand that it was not. Until Thor, threatened to pummel him. Yeah. So, but this really gets into what happens after Loki makes mistakes. He doesn't really run from them. In this instance, he went off to find a solution for Sif. This is when he went to the world of the dwarves. And wanted to commission the most famous dwarf brothers to make 3 separate gifts for the Asgardians. Well, things didn't go quite well with the famous brothers. But there was another set of brothers that he thought fair game. So in order to get them to make these gifts for him, he struck a deal. I don't think he ever learns that deals are not a good thing for him. But he told them that if they couldn't make anything as grand or as wonderful as the most famous dwarven brothers, then he owed them nothing. And when the dwarves asked what they got in return, if they did, then Loki promised them his head. Yeah. So, again, just like with the giant and the wall, quickly discovered they probably could. Despite Loki's best efforts, even transforming himself into a fly to bite at them and distract them from their work. That did, however, cause the handle of the hammer they were building to be a bit too short. And so he gathers these gifts, he brings them all back to Asgard, he lays them down, he gives Odin his spear, Thor his hammer, and Sif her wonderful hair made of gold. And the Asgardians loved them. They're the best gifts ever. So now Loki owed some dwarves his head. In the end, obviously, Loki, being as cunning as he is, did not give them his head. But when they demanded their payment and went to retrieve said payment, Loki informed them that he had promised them his head, not his neck, which they would have had to cut to get his head. Now that they're outraged by this, they decided they were just going to sew his mouth shut, so he could speak no more deceptions. And that's where that story comes from. But again, in the end, let's take a look at this timeline. Loki messes up. Loki fixes it. At his own cost. I'm sorry, but, still not screaming villain to me. There is also one story that I've discovered isn't really spoken about as much that I feel is really important to understanding Loki's character. The peasant and the giant. So, what happened here was a peasant, as most peasants are, was not doing well financially, or in any way, really. He had a wife and a son, and he needed to provide for them. Well, he knew that there was a wealthy giant that lived on the hill, and he decided he would play a strategy game with the giant. And if he won, he could ask the giant for anything. When the giant asked what he would get from it, the peasant told him anything he wanted. Lo and behold, the giant won. And when it came time for the giant to pick, he told the peasant he wanted his son. Obviously, that would not fly with the peasant. Shouldn't have bargained anything. Let that be a lesson, guys. Don't bargain anything. So they run to Odin, which I guess was common back then. And Odin does his best. He transforms the peasant boy into a single blade of grass. And when the giant comes looking, he looks and he looks and he looks, and he's going through the halls of Asgard, of the palace, looking for this boy. And he gets to the garden. And he starts inspecting the blades of grass one by one. Odin, seeing this, quickly retransforms the boy and hustles him back to his parents and tells them that he can do no more. The giant, deciding he likes this game, decides to give the parents one more day to hide the child. And if he can't find him, then they can keep him. But if he does, yeah. So, they do the only thing left that they can think of, and always the last resort, Loki gets called upon. Loki doesn't get anything from the situation. I really want to point that out. He doesn't get anything from the situation, but he still helps them. He transforms the boy into the smallest egg and hides him in the sea. On top of this, Loki also goes to intercept the giant on his way to distract him. Distracts him for as long as possible until he begins to sniff out the boy. What Loki did doesn't stop the giant from finding the boy. It doesn't. But Loki does put an end to the situation. He transforms the boy, just like Odin did, and tells him to go back to his parents, to run. And the boy does. And what Loki does in return is kill the giant. He doesn't try to find another way. He doesn't just tell them that there's nothing more he can do. He solves the problem and saves the child. Which is another reason why I kind of find it hard to believe that he didn't really care about Sleipnir. Because if he cared that much about a peasant boy, why wouldn't he care about his own kid? When it comes to killing Balder, all people really seem to talk about is the actual act and the trickery of it, and how Loki is inevitably the villain from it. Look at the media you see nowadays. The Marvel franchise, both the comics and the cinematic universe. The Netflix show, or shows, actually, where Loki is the villain. I just find it to be a bit misleading for people wanting to get into Norse mythology. Because the death of Balder didn't come out of nowhere. Loki was very upset. And it wasn't really anything to do with Balder himself, or really even jealousy. It was about his children. Loki, besides Sleipnir, went on to have 3 children with another Jotun, Angerboda. Now, when Odin caught wind of these children, obviously he wasn't happy. They weren't children in his eyes, they were monsters. Simply because of what they looked like. And yeah, they were a little off-putting. But at the same time, they had never done anything to him, besides what he supposedly saw in a vision. So, in order to stop this prophecy from coming true, he sent the other gods to hunt them down. And they did. The oldest of these children was Fenrir, the great wolf. Now, Fenrir was considered to be the most dangerous of these children. And even though Odin knew that, he decided that if he kept Fenrir in Asgard and tamed him, then maybe the prophecy wouldn't come true. The second of these children, I love saying this name, Horgmundur, the world serpent, or the Midgard serpent. Now, this is where, because Horgmundur wasn't as important, and he didn't feel that he was as dangerous, Odin decided to just throw the poor kid into the sea. Yep, that is how he gets the title of the world serpent, because in the seas he grew and he grew and he grew until he could wrap around the world. But there was no more space for him, so he had to start eating his own tail. That's where all of the imagery of the snake eating his own tail comes from. That's Horgmundur. The third of these children was a girl. Her name was Hel. I know, not that kind of Hel. I guess kind of, if you think about it. The thing with Hel was that she was half dead. Now, there's some discrepancy here on what parts of her were half dead. Some say she was split evenly down the middle. Others say she was split in half, like waist down and then waist up. Either way, half alive, half dead. And again, Odin decided she wasn't as dangerous. She wasn't as important. So he threw her into the world of the dead, which she, in the end, began to rule. And then it was called after her, Hel. And I guess you could say having his children exiled and taken from him didn't make Loki the happiest. But he kind of viewed it as a situation where he couldn't do anything about it. And really at the time he couldn't. So he just kind of had to move on. And in this came Sigyn. With Sigyn, he had 2 more children. She was the goddess of devotion and mercy. So, I still think that's kind of cute. Opposites attract, you know? But they had 2 more children, Vali and Narfi. Well, Loki was still upset. He finally got to have a taste of what it would be like to keep his children and raise them. And he obviously and validly was upset that Odin had cast his others away. So he decided to kill Balder, the favorite, because he wanted Odin to know what it felt like to lose a child. So he did trick Balder's blind brother Hod into killing him with a twig of mistletoe. I'm not saying that didn't happen, and I'm not saying he wasn't wrong for it. What I am saying is that there was a pretty damn good reason. In the end, though, and I really wish that's where the story ended, but it doesn't. Odin, furious with this, of course, abducts Vali and Narfi. So, when he abducted them, he, of course, had the others hunt Loki down. Yeah. And forced him and Sigyn, poor Sigyn, to watch as he turned Vali into a wolf. Vali, now a wolf, not in his right mind, proceeded to tear Narfi into shreds. Completely rip him apart. And then he continued to force the parents to watch as Thor killed Vali. Again, I wish this ended here, but unfortunately it does not. Not only had Odin just essentially tortured his children to death, he decided that Loki was to be bound. They dragged Loki into the dark depths of a cave and bound him to a slab of rock using his son's entrails. And as if that was not bad enough, they drug a snake into the cave and set it up to where the venom from the snake's fangs would drip into his eyes. And he was to be bound there until Ragnarok. Sigyn, ever faithful, kind of depressing at this point, would proceed to spend his sentence with him, holding a bowl over his eyes to catch the venom as it dripped. She would eventually have to dump the bowl and listen to Loki's screams as the venom got into his eyes before being able to place it back in place. One thing I haven't talked about a lot, I've mentioned it, obviously, is Ragnarok. Ragnarok is the end of days in Norse mythology. It is the great battle, the last hurrah. And the reason why Loki was so scared of the trickster himself and his children is because of the fact that in the end, he saw Loki fighting with the giants and his children fighting with the giants and killing them. So, but in the end, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. In more ways than one. Loki would have continued to be a friend of the Aesir if Odin hadn't have wronged his children like that. And I find it still very hard to believe that Loki was really truly the villain. And I'm not saying I'm right and other people are wrong, because that's the thing about opinions. They're not always right. But I do want to ask one last time. Was Loki really the villain here? And that's a wrap. Oh my god. Good God almighty.
You just have to edit that.
I don't even want to talk about it.